Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Barlo Dermagerdician of the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State. I'd like to welcome you to this, no, I was going to say in person, but it's not. It's a Zoom lecture that we're presenting as part of the spring lecture series of the Armenian. Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Barlo Dermagerdician of the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State. I'd like to welcome you to this, no, I was going to say in. Okay, so let me, we were also recording, so I've got a couple of things going on as we're moving on with it. So this evening, everyone, we are going to be listening to a presentation by Dr. Artyom Tonoyan on his book that he has edited called Black Garden Aflame, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in the Soviet and Russian press. And he was also going to discuss this evening a presentation on Ukraine today, and he'll talk to you a little bit about that connection. Before I formally introduce our guest this evening, I'd like to share the screen with you to talk to you about some of the upcoming events of the Armenian Studies program. So let's do that. And in the month of April, we have several upcoming events that I would like to introduce you to. Coming up this Saturday is going to be an in-person concert by Boris Alakverdian, who is the principal clarinet at the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, together with his wife, Aline Alakverdian, who will be accompanying him on the piano. This concert will take place at 6 p.m. Saturday, April the 2nd, on the Fresno State campus in our concert hall. Tickets will be available at the door, so you're encouraged to come and to visit and to listen to this very interesting concert. Then on Wednesday, April the 20th, Dr. Richard Hovhannisyan will be visiting Fresno State in an in-person lecture on the Armenians of Persia and Iran. This is celebrating the new publication of the book by the same name. Dr. Richard Hovhannisyan is Emeritus Professor of Armenian and Near Eastern History at UCLA, and the lecture will take place at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, April the 20th in the University Business Center Alice Peters Auditorium on the Fresno State campus. And on Friday, April 22nd, as part of the Cineculture program here at Fresno State, the Armenian Studies program and Cineculture will present a movie discussion with the director Mariam Avadisyan on the film The Desire to Live. And the film can be accessed and watched in the week previous to the discussion. So the Friday, April 22nd will be the discussion, and then at 5:30 p.m. will be the discussion based on the film, and you watched the film in the week before. The links are here, and if you need it, you can also go to our website or to our Facebook page. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Artyom Tonoyan, who was born in Gyumri and grew up in Gyumri, Armenia, but now makes his home in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where for the past 6 years, he was a research associate at the University of Minnesota's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. By training, he's a sociologist, and his research focuses on the intersection of religion and nationalism in Russia and the South Caucasus. Presently, he's guest editing the Journal of Law and Religion, which is Cambridge University Press, for a forthcoming symposium on religion and law in Russia. He received his doctorate from Baylor University, where he also held a lectureship at the J.M. Dawson Institute of Church-State Studies and the Department of Political Science. This evening, he's going to present his new book that he's edited, Black Garden Aflame, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in the Soviet and Russian press. It deals with the press accounts of the Karabakh issue that appeared in both the Soviet and later the Russian press. So he'll be talking about that. And then we've asked him as part of the Armenian Studies program to ask him to speak tonight also a little bit about the situation, the war in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia, because he has some personal knowledge of that and also has studied that. So we'll ask him to do that as well. So I'd like to introduce at this time Dr. Artyom Tonoyan to present this evening about his new book. Dr. Tonoyan?
Thank you, Barlo, and thank you to Fresno State, and thank you also to Sergio for facilitating this talk. I'm greatly honored to be giving a talk at the Armenian Studies program, which is a fairly storied institution in the field of Armenian studies in this country. And why not globally? So I feel tremendously honored to be to have the opportunity to speak to you and to your guests. So we'll talk about the book, and before we sort of start talking about the gist of the book, at first I would like to say what really precipitated and what gave the idea for the book. The idea came fairly early, sort of, when the war broke out in September of 2020, when Azerbaijan and Turkey essentially attacked Nagorno-Karabakh and parts of Armenia. What happened was that there was, when the conflict just broke out, there was about a 10-day silence from Vladimir Putin. And if anyone knows anything about Russian politics and Vladimir Putin, you know that a lot of things are micromanaged and a lot of things are done according to the whims and the wishes and the desires of Vladimir Putin. But for 10 days, Putin was silent. I mean, the foreign minister was speaking, lots of government officials were talking, lots of press coverage was taking place, newspaper articles, and so on and so forth. But the Kremlin had chosen this silence. Which was sort of an awkward thing for a lot of the observers of the conflict, and people couldn't figure out, why is Vladimir Putin silent? Can't he see that Armenia is under attack? Then there are treaty obligations within the CSTO and mutual treaty obligations, and Russia is not coming to Armenia's rescue, and so on and so forth. If this sort of interpretation was to be expected from non-regional observers or regional experts, what was interesting that shocked or dismayed or surprised were also lots of Armenian analysts, Armenian experts, and of course the Armenian diaspora and the Armenian population in the Republic. So that sort of precipitated, that gave the idea of maybe we do not understand the Kremlin, and maybe the Armenian Kremlinology is bad, or I would like to say doesn't exist. As Russia being Armenia's closest sort of political, military, and economic ally, there was a lot of gap in Armenians' knowledge of the inner workings of the Kremlin. To be sure, there's a lot of gap of knowledge exists also in the West, but Armenians, you would think, would have a much better understanding and a much better read of the Kremlin and its intentions, its voice and its silence, so to speak. So that sort of gave rise to the idea about the book, and I said, how about I try to basically get together lots of articles and see if I can sort of serve the expert community on a plate, as it were, a collection of long durée articles that goes back for 3 decades and sort of give the people, the experts and the readers, an understanding of the reasons of Vladimir Putin's silence. So that's how it sort of came about. And I wrote the introduction to the texts, the newspaper articles that I gathered, and I'll read a little bit from the introduction, just to give you a better idea of why this book sort of is needed, why this book came to be, and why everyone should buy it. So the South Caucasus is not the center of the attention of Western media, to say the least. Occasional coverage of the region falls largely into 2 categories: tourism, more often than not commissioned advertorials by local ministries of tourism, or war, as in the case of Georgia, South Ossetia in 2008. When it comes to the South Caucasus, journalism largely consists in saying Lord Jones is dead to people who never knew Lord Jones was alive, in the words of the inimitable G.K. Chesterton. People usually do not know or perhaps do not care about the region until and unless something of note takes place. In general, it's something of a blessing to the Western audiences when Russia is involved, in which case a ready-made geopolitical framing of the issues of concern can be pulled out of the drawer and given a new shine. Such a verdict may sound overly dolorous or unduly cynical, with apologies to those tireless journalists who risk life and limb to cover the region in times of profound crisis for little personal gain. But it may not be that far from the truth. This is another way of saying that Western journalistic interests probably match the general or even the precise contours of Western geopolitical interest in the region. Be that as it may, the Russian media's footprint in the region has been far larger and far deeper, if not more storied. The point made here does not mean that it was better, but it was more, infinitely more. As such, the output of Soviet and Russian journalists on the happenings in the region in general, and on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in particular, is a veritable mountain next to a veritable molehill. We can only hope that the book the reader is holding will prove to be a worthy Sherpa as the reader tries to climb that mountain. As we wrote above, Russian knowledge of the region is as vast as it is intimate. It is with this intimate familiarity in mind that Eastview Press has made available to specialists and general readers alike this carefully selected, translated, and edited collection of articles that have appeared in the Soviet and the post-Soviet Russian media since the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict first began. The goal of the book is to provide both the broadest and the deepest context of Russian understanding of the conflict, as it has been dissected, litigated, and relitigated on the pages of the Soviet and Russian press. To be sure, there is no such thing as the Russian view of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. There are and always have been multiple views on how to settle it. Depending on the political and increasingly geopolitical winds blowing in the region, Moscow has at times favored Yerevan and at other times Baku, but in all circumstances, it has favored Moscow, to no one's surprise. So when presenting such a collection, the immediate question that needs answering is what is so special about the Russian and the Soviet press coverage of the conflict? The importance of the Soviet and Russian press coverage can be perhaps summed up in the words of Bernard Cecil Cohen when he wrote way back in 1964 about a different war and a different geopolitical setting, that the press is significantly more than a purveyor of information and opinion. It may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but it is stunningly successful in telling its readers what to think about. With this in mind, it is my purpose to introduce readers' most comprehensive press coverage of the conflict, apart from the press of the conflicting countries, hoping that readers will learn and study the entire range of the issues that Soviet and Russian commentators, analysts, and politicians consider worth examining and commenting upon. In short, what people should both think and think about. So that is sort of the reason behind the book. And as a social scientist, another thing that was going through my mind when I conceived of this book, having extensive conversations with the publisher and the CEO of the press, was when I was a student myself doing my dissertation research, what seems to be a lifetime ago. You know, it was very difficult to come across or to come by primary sources, news reports. You know, the internet was very well developed, but a lot of the stuff was still unavailable, and you had to think, you know, how to grant money to travel to Armenia or Russia and to get these newspapers and trying to write up and so on and so forth. So one of the other reasons that was in my mind was basically to do the gathering of this information and present it in a book format, thereby, undermining the excuses of many graduate students that we can't find money to travel to the region and to get the newspapers. now they have no such excuse after I have put together this book. So what the book is, when I put together these articles, a lot of it, I read about, I will not lie if I say that I read about 2,500 probably articles, maybe 2,000, but definitely no less than 2,000 articles, and trying to figure out how to have these articles translated. Some of them had already been translated, and I worked with a team of translators that the publisher has. And I was thinking how to sort of put it together and what the ultimate shape will the book take. And so I decided that to do just a simple chronology, you take the first article that was published about the conflict in 1987, late 1987, beginning of 1988, and then move all the way to the 2020 war. It would be rather, it could have been done that way, but it sort of would muddy the water. So I decided to divide into 4 large sections, the book. I got around, I think, 400 articles and divided them into 4 different sections. So one section basically covers the origins of the conflict, how the conflict started appearing in the Soviet press, from the very first article that appeared in Pravda and in Bakinsky Rabochi, the Azerbaijani newspaper that was the main party organ of the Azerbaijani Communist Party. I even remember when I was a child how this article appeared in Pravda and how my father was outraged, how little was covered in that article about what had happened in Sumgait. So I took the first part of the book is prior to Sumgait. Sumgait, February 28th of 1988 is the day that Armenians were set upon in Azerbaijan's town not far from Baku and killed through massacres and pogroms. So I took the first part, the demonstrations, the peaceful demonstrations in Yerevan and throughout the Armenian cities, and how the Soviet press was covering these mass demonstrations after Armenians were massing in the streets of Yerevan and demanding political reforms and demanding for the transfer of the Nagorno-Karabakh under Armenian jurisdiction from Azerbaijan. The second part of the book sort of segues into also in the first part, we talk about the articles cover the pogroms in Sumgait, in Baku, and in Kirovabad. The part 2 segues into the press coverage of the international dimensions of the conflict. As the conflict was developing, it was in the beginning until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the December 1991. The conflict was an internal Soviet affair, and it was largely guerrilla warfare between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And part 2 basically covers the internationalization of the conflict. When the Soviet Union collapses, it were no longer 2 Soviet republics going at each other over a piece of land, but it was now an international conflict. The 2 nation states were going at each other, and that sort of broadened the scope of the conflict, made it deadlier because now Armenia and Azerbaijan had armies, not just no longer guerrilla warfare was happening. And with the internationalization of the conflict, you invite the circumstances, rather invite international intervention and setting up of international organizations tasked with managing the conflict. And the part 3 focuses on the involvement of extra regional actors, if you will. Armenia and Azerbaijan are in the South Caucasus, but this is also a territory where regional powers have interests, sometimes overlapping, sometimes clashing, most of the time clashing, and how these international actors try to insert themselves in the conflict to either manage it or to gain benefit from. So in this respect, I got mostly 4 countries that were interesting personally to me to look at the newspaper reports and to see how the Russians understood, first of all, their own involvement in the regional affairs. The second, that was super interesting to me to see the involvement of Turkey in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and how it was trying to manage or support or undermine Armenia. The third country that was interesting, albeit not a whole lot of coverage existed in the Russian press, but nevertheless, the ones that existed are quite interesting for experts to know and understand and read sort of how the Russians viewed the Iranian angle, how Iran understood the conflict and why Iran took some positions that sort of didn't make sense, but Russians tried to understand it. And the fourth is the involvement of the United States. We should understand that after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the withdrawal of Russia from the regional politics, there was a great power vacuum in a sense. And these different countries were vying about exerting influence. And I was interested in seeing how the United States made its way into the Caucasus, into our corner of the land, and how the Russians were understanding it, and what were their apprehensions, what were their fears, and how did the Russians try to manage the appearance of the United States in the region, which for all intents and purposes didn't exist until the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, in 1910s, the US had military involvement in the region, but it was very limited. And then with the establishment of the Soviet Union, it was no more. Yes, NATO was involved sort of in blocking the area from Russian or Soviet expansionism with the aid of Turkey and so on and so forth. But the collapse of the Soviet Union sort of occasioned redrawing of the geopolitical map of the region, and invited sort of different actors into the region. So some of the interesting things that I observed in putting together these articles were sort of that I think would be interesting for the readers or for the audience here to know. And the two vectors that I mentioned, Russia and Turkey, are very interesting to me personally as a researcher. How the positions of Russia and Turkey sort of played out in this conflict. Some interesting things when you put together a collection like this emerges when you look at it from sort of a God's eye view and try to understand what's going on by just reading the newspapers, the news reports, is how consistent the Russian sort of state position, Russian government position has been on the conflict and the conflict resolution. Ever since the conflict broke out in 1988 until 2020, most of the rhetoric emanating from the Russian government is extremely consistent, that they're seeking an equitable solution to the conflict, that they're seeking to make sure that Armenia and Azerbaijan get sort of a fair treatment, and no other side is sort of the total winner of the war. And their position sort of always moved in that direction. That was their prerogative. And when I think about, like what image could sort of give an idea about the Russian conduct is, I am a person who is greatly afraid of water. If you drop me in the water, I'll just sink. As I swim as well as a rock. And last summer rather, I had the chance to kayak all by myself. And when you have this, or when you're kayaking, if you move the oar just on one side, you start making circles. So you have to move the oar left and right, left and right, left and right. So when you look at the Russian position, it was always going ahead, but sometimes taking one too many sort of rowing to one side, so the boat would be moving in one direction, and then down the road you would start correcting on the other, so the boat would be going left and right, but always sort of ahead. So that was sort of the idea in my head when I was looking at how the Russian position sort of evolved throughout the years. Russia would, on occasion, be making pronouncements that were pro-Armenian or perceived to be pro-Armenian, and then signing treaty agreements with Armenia. And on other occasions, when Russia was trying to extract concessions from Armenia or put pressure on Armenia, they would start making pronouncements that could be perceived as pro-Azerbaijan, and the Armenian leadership would freak out, and so on and so forth. And the other issue is about the Turkish position, which is really, really interesting. When when I was putting together these articles, there were several that about the Russian perceptions of how the Turks were inserting themselves in the conflict. There were some articles that really jumped at me, and I was glad to have uncovered them and put this in this book. One of the most notable articles here is an interview with the Turkish ambassador to the Soviet Union or Russia when Azerbaijan and Armenia become independent, and Turkey is, I think, the first country to recognize Azerbaijan's independence. And a journalist from Russia's newspaper Izvestia sits down with the ambassador of Turkey to Russia for an interview. And they talk about all these issues, different issues, Armenia, Azerbaijan, independence. And the very penultimate Q&A section goes like this. All right then, so Turkey regards Azerbaijan as an independent state. What if after a certain period of time, Baku suddenly asks to sell weapons to it? Naturally, the answer is, ambassador answers, naturally we will not be able to grant such a request, for the simple reason that Ankara knows full well just where such weapons would be sent. And in general, my country strives to promote resolution of any conflicts solely by peaceful means. This is our firm position. Furthermore, a decision was recently adopted to reduce the strength of the Turkish armed forces by 50%. This is Turkish government's position in 1991 at the height of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, or in the middle of it. And boy, has it changed, huh? Turkey appears this reasonable international actor, constrained by its Eurocentric ambitions. It wants to put this humanitarian face on its foreign policy, and it's saying we don't want to further inflame the conflict by pouring gasoline on it and sending weapons to Azerbaijan. And it only took them about 25, 30 years or so, about 29 years to change their position and become from a bystander who aspire to be a just referee in the conflict, to participant of the conflict, and using its territory, using its intelligence services, to transport jihadis from Syria, using its air force in suppression of enemy air defenses against Armenians, and of course supplying Azerbaijan with ton of weaponry and military advisors and the ubiquitous drone technology that they have, inflicting damage on Armenian armor and ultimately assisting Azerbaijan in winning the war in 2020. Such a change. And you can sort of trace this change through the years. And some interesting changes that they happened and why they resulted in these changes by the Turkish government were Armenian battleground successes in Nagorno-Karabakh during the First War. After each Armenian battleground success, whether it was the taking of Shushi, whether it was taking of Kalbajar region, and so on and so forth, Turkish position would become ever more hostile towards Armenia, which is understandable in a sense. Turkey and Azerbaijan are cultural and religious and ethno-linguistic ties are thoroughgoing, so it was to be expected. But reading these articles and noticing the evolution of the position, the change of the dynamics, is something that was interesting to me just as a researcher. So, and the book has many more moments like this. As I said, this may be a rather boring read for people that are not specialists on the topic. But I think in the hands of the researchers, this book is a unique enterprise, and I think it can be helpful in trying to sort of give a broad understanding or broad sort of contextual background about the conflict and how the Russians sort of viewed it, how they envisioned it, how they envisioned regional cooperation, how they envisioned sort of a peace that is lasting, but at the same time, in a way that it doesn't take away Russia's leverage from the region, and it doesn't take away from Russia's security interests in the region. So that is sort of about the book. Barlo, do you want me to sort of talk about Ukraine now, or how do we do this?
Yeah, I think you can do that now, and then when you've completed that, then we'll open it up for questions on either section, on the book or on Ukraine.
Okay.
Then you can just do that.
So about Ukraine, as I like to say, I was in the military in Armenia a long time ago. I did my mandatory service in 1990s, served on the border with Azerbaijan. I'm not a military expert. I do not have a specialized military knowledge about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine in the conflict, but I do have some family ties, extensive family ties in Ukraine and in Russia, but mostly in Ukraine. I lived in Ukraine in 1990s myself. My wife is from Ukraine. My brother lived in Ukraine in Lugansk. I lived myself in Kharkiv, or Kharkiv as the Ukrainians call it. Extensive ties, but I also studied Ukrainian religious life. I studied Ukrainian Protestantism for a bit when I was doing your generic sociology of religion in the Max Weberian vein. I was studying the connection between religiosity and economic performance, using Max Weber's, the Protestant ethic paradigm, but also refined and reworked some of my dissertation advisor Peter Berger's work. And so I've done extensive I have extensive cultural, linguistic, and religious knowledge about the region, but I am not a military expert. So my expertise is rather limited on that. Having said that, what interests me in this conflict personally, and as an Armenian scholar, is how is this going to impact, or how is this war impacting presently Armenia's predicament, Armenia's economic, political situation, and of course, the biggest question of them all: how is this conflict going to influence the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict? Because for the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, this is an existential situation. And Azerbaijan, as predicted, I predicted, you don't have to be an expert to sort of predict it. I predicted that as soon as the war happens, Azerbaijan is going to be using it as an opportunity to sort of poke Armenia further and put into motion its long-held plans to rid the Armenians, to rid the region of its Armenian inhabitants who have lived there for centuries, if not millennia. So there isn't much to be said on that other than the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh is dire. Azerbaijan has extensively, Azerbaijan for all its human rights abuses, for all the kleptocracy that exists there, for all the nefarious activities of its leadership, going after human rights activists, going after the Armenians, buying up politicians in this country and in Europe, and buying up experts, setting up all sorts of organizations and so on and so forth. One thing you cannot take away from the leadership of Azerbaijan and from the Azerbaijani president Ilham Aliyev is that his timing is just impeccable. When the war in 2020 launched, he knew exactly when to launch the war. It was the height of the absolutely asinine and crazy campaign season in this country. It was all about Trump. Everybody was distracted. It was all about the elections between Biden and Trump. And not a day went by when the political situation in this country wasn't becoming ever crazier than the day before or the hour before. So the West and the United States were extremely distracted, and Aliyev and Erdogan of Turkey used that moment to their great advantage. It was rather disheartening to see such paucity of coverage of the conflict in the American press or on the American media. It was like the conflict never happened. It was a small blip on the radar of the media in this country, and that's also one reason why this book is important, because it was not a blip on the Russian media landscape. And so this time around, Aliyev again proves himself to be a master manipulator of time, or master understanding of where the winds are blowing. And when the war started, many of you probably don't know, the day before, Aliyev traveled and met with Vladimir Putin. The day before this war started in Ukraine, him and Putin met a day before and had almost a champagne Bruderschaft, drinking champagne together and celebrating a new alliance treaty agreement that were signed between Azerbaijan and Russia. And as soon as the war launches, Azerbaijan sort of starts measuring the pulse of the world and where the wind is blowing, and sees that Russians are extremely busy, Russians are extremely stretched, Russians are extremely distracted. And what does he do? He starts escalating the situation in the country. So that is sort of in Nagorno-Karabakh, by cutting off the gas and so on and so forth. So that is sort of what is the interesting aspect here. But we can have maybe a Q&A where people would ask questions about what's happening in Ukraine, and I can try to answer the questions to the best of my abilities. It is rather a bit difficult to sort of talk about what's happening in Ukraine right now in terms of the military developments, because everything is changing by the hour. But I keep up with the news and I talk to the experts, and I'll try to be as informative as I can if you have questions about that.
Thank you, Dr. Tonoyan, for both the overview of the book and also I know some of your thoughts about Ukraine and how that affects both Karabakh and other areas. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and put those, write those in the chat. And I'm going to take the liberty to ask you a first question about the book, because I'm interested in the press. Of course, in the Soviet period, the Soviet press was the official press. But after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, how much of the press is actually independent? And did that have an effect on the way that the Russians saw the Karabakh issue?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And it's a very good question. Yes, in the Soviet Union, there was the official line and you could not stray left or right, right? There was the official line. There were the official experts handpicked by the government, and the press people went and interviewed. Maybe didn't even interview, that told them this is what you're going to be saying in the newspaper. You don't have, the option of agreeing or not agreeing. This is the official party line. So, but interestingly, when the conflict was happening in the Soviet Union, late 1980s, yes, there was the official press, but this was also the time of liberalization of the political situation in the Soviet Union. So you had writers or opinion page writers or so on and so forth who had their own opinion, and they could express it without being afraid of being sent to join the Siberian, symphony orchestra. This is late 1980s when Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika are happening. So people are more or less sort of free to do that. But at the same time, 90% probably of the reportage that you saw in the Soviet Central Press, two newspapers in particular, is Izvestia and Pravda, the two flagship Soviet publications, were sort of trying to give the official Soviet government's view, and a lot of that writing was bombastic. It was, this is the Soviet government's position. We're going to do this. We're going to do the economic reforms and so on and so forth. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the proliferation of these independent newspapers, you have also proliferation of a diversity of views. Having said that, one thing that probably all journalists everywhere in this country or in Germany or in France, when it comes to foreign policy issues, most of the local journalism, in a sense, reflects the official position of the government. It's very rare, just look at the newspaper, New York Times, right? Washington Post or LA Times or Boston Globe. When it comes to issues of big concern, Ukraine or the Iran nuclear deal or so on and so forth, most of the coverage that you're going to have, you have journalists referring to sources in the government, right? Because they have to sort of, their raison d'etre is not carrying the American flag, but the reportage coming from the American press is going to reflect the US government's position. That's sort of the given. And the same happened in Russia when it comes to these issues and the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict too. Yes, you have Armenian experts being interviewed, or Armenian actually journalists or Azeri journalists writing in Russian newspapers. There is this independent ideas or independent views expressed. But when the government is speaking and the government is being expressing a position, you have journalism reflecting that position. Sometimes they challenged it, but most of the time it rarely goes challenged, because the government sort of has to keep it on message.
There's a question: how detailed and in what way did the Russian media cover the ethnic killings and civilian refugees during the First Karabakh War?
Uh, so, uh, uh, um, what must be said that they were in shock when you read the reports from reports about the killings in Sumgait. It was shock not just for the journalists. It was an entirely different shock of a different magnitude for the country. And when you read these articles, you realize how much the Soviet system was not sort of ready to see these sort of events happening within its borders. So you have a lot of initial shock, followed by outrage from the government, also, but from the journalists. But the coverage was pretty detailed, I must say. There was lots of, lots of coverage of the pogroms, especially in Baku and in Sumgait, and especially in Sumgait, when this was something so new, something so scandalous for the Soviet Union and for the Soviet media landscape, that a lot of coverage existed, and there was coverage of the trials of the perpetrators of the massacres in Sumgait. So it was fairly well covered, but at the same time, you have to realize that a lot of this coverage was also muted because the Soviet government did not want to make the problem any worse than it already was. So a lot of the coverage also was sort of editorializing, trying to mitigate the conflict rather than try to play it up and make it worse.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question too on the first section of your book, which was about the origins of the Karabakh issue. How do they interpret? How did the Soviet press interpret Stalin's role? Was there any criticism at all? Was that included? Did it go back that far as the Karabakh issue? Where does it start for the Russians?
Yeah, well, in the book, I deliberately chose 1987 and 88. So I didn't want to go back because I wanted just the conflict and on. You had lots of articles criticizing the nationalities policies. Absolutely. And interestingly enough, what was happening in Sumgait and what was happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, there was also sort of calls for soul searching on how to reform the nationalities policies, sort of how to make it more equitable, more just, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of that happening. The criticism, most of the stuff that I saw was not a robust. I'm sure there were some robust ones that I've missed. There were not robust criticism of the existing system, but there was lots of sort of decrying on how these issues were dealt with and how, a time bomb was laid under the entire system, and the time bomb was never diffused, and it has now gone off. So you absolutely get that sense, and there was lots of criticism.
So would official Yerevan should have been aware that the press really does reflect so the Russian official position to a certain extent? Shouldn't they perhaps have been more attuned to that? I mean, I'm sure they were reading those papers.
I'm sure they were reading, and I'm sure a lot of it went over their head. Years ago, I watched a documentary about the great French postmodernist philosopher Jacques Derrida. And there was an episode when the interviewer goes to Jacques Derrida's personal library, which has like about 50,000 books in his basement or somewhere. And he looks in awe at these books, and he's in a temple of books almost. And he says, "Dr. Derrida, you have read all of these books?" And Derrida looks in the camera and he says, "No, only 3, but I have read them very well." The problem was not reading the Soviet newspapers or reading the air temperature in the Kremlin, but reading it very well. And I think Armenian experts and the Armenian expert community and the Armenian government didn't read it very well. They read the papers, but they didn't read it well.
Right.
If
So
you
there's
know-
a question now on Ukraine. Could you comment on the question is, could you comment on the religious background of Ukraine and any influence it has on the current conflict?
Actually, interesting. I have written something about it. About 8 years ago, I was part of a colloquium working group out of Boston University. We're working on the religious. In sociology, there is something that we love to discuss. Sociologists of religion love to discuss, called secularism and secularization. And there was a project about counter-secularization happening in different global, different world regions. And I was writing about Russia and how and who are sort of the main forces of counter-secularization, institutions, persons, religious leaders, religious entrepreneurs that are trying to sort of roll back the forces of secularization in the Russian public discourse and in Russian culture. And I wrote a book chapter that came out recently based off that work. There is actually lots of religious connections in what's happening. There is a great deal of sort of resurgence of Russian Orthodox fundamentalist thought that sort of tries to rewrite Russian self-perception of itself in global affairs. And in many cases, this redefinition of what it means to be a Russian, what Russia is, a lot of this discourse is conducted along religious lines. Now, and Ukraine and in Russia in this confrontation, and some of these sort of the individuals and institutions and organizations in Russia that are from this fundamentalist wing of the Russian Orthodox Church are at the forefront of sort of leading the charge of battle against Ukraine. Because for them, Kiev is like their Jerusalem for a lot of this thinking. And the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church has, over the last several years, come under the sway and the influence of some of these influential fundamentalist groups and individuals. He's at least sort of paying them homage. He's trying to keep them at bay. And one way you keep them at bay is you give them, crumbs from the table, or you allow them to the banquet table where they can then, make fateful decisions and influence political decision makers.
I was going to ask you about that, about Ukraine as well, as far as one of the Russian narratives is that, there is no Ukrainian history, right? It's just part of Russia. But what is Ukrainian self-perception in terms of before the war, in terms of their own nationalism and their own sense of nationhood? Was it very strong already?
It's a very interesting question and a very loaded question and a very, very important question at the same time. When I lived there, I lived in Kharkiv. It's the second largest city, by and large, a Russian-speaking city. And, coming from an Armenian family, genocide survivors, my grandparents were genocide survivors. And in 1980s, you could not be cooked in the cauldron of Armenian nationalism, right? In 1980s, when the Armenians are becoming these super attuned to Armenian national aspirations. And when in 1990s, I ended up in Kharkiv in Ukraine, I was at awe of how much unpatriotic about Ukraine were some of my peers, some of my friends, some of my coworkers. That was just mind-boggling for me They were not interested in Ukrainian culture. They were not interested in Ukrainian folk music. Whereas, I grew up in a family when my father, all he listened to was Armenian folk music. And all we listened to, all we read was Rafi and Mikhail Nalbandian and all of these people, or Charents or Sevag or Shiraz. We were like all of it. And I was just stunned how this was happening. But then you would travel to western part of Ukraine or even to Kiev. The dynamic was completely different. Not that everybody was walking around wearing Ukrainian national shirts or T-shirts or saying, "Oh, I'm Ukrainian and I take pride in it," but it was different. Linguistically, they were different. They were sort of more attuned to their culture. They took pride in in the western part of the country. They took pride in the history of Ukraine and so on and so forth. So you could already in 1990s you could see that, and but since then a lot of it has changed. Ukraine's educational system has undergone tremendous changes. Their national history curriculum has undergone tremendous changes. And how do you make, I can't remember, was it Giuseppe Mazzini who said, after we created Italians, now we have to create Italy. It was sort of that dynamic. We had the Ukrainians, now we have to create Ukraine, because it was such lots of dispersed, diverse cultural expressions and so on and so forth. So one way you create a good Ukrainian and a strong Ukraine is you write the proper quote unquote history. And through these decades, that proper history had been in the curriculum. So that sense of nationhood was only going to grow and going to grow deeper. So the last time I was there some years ago, you could already see some of this difference. There's a lot of the Russian language schools in Kharkiv no longer existed. There were lots of Ukrainian language schools and so on and so forth. A lot of the TV programming switched from Russian to Ukrainian. So all of that sort of cultivated a strong sense of nationhood that anecdotally, in my personal experience, was absent when I was there. Which is not to say that sense of nationhood was not existent. Of course it existed, and it existed in different parts of the country to different degrees. But the more it went, and especially after the 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, this sort of becomes highly charged and almost, on steroids when all of that starts entering into the public discourse and so on and so forth.
So we have one or two more questions. One question is back on the Nagorno-Karabakh, but an interesting question. You mentioned that Putin had gone silent during the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Today's American intelligence is reporting that Putin is reportedly isolating himself in the midst of the Ukrainian conflict. Do you see a pattern? If so, is it based on your knowledge, what do you think is behind his current isolation and silence?
I think current isolation is silence. He's scared. He's paranoid, I think, about catching COVID. And I think that has to do a lot with him isolating himself. You've probably seen the table, a 30, 40 feet table, and people sitting away from him. He has a rigorous system by which everyone is tested who's coming into contact with him. They have to be tested and COVID-free for a week or so on and so forth, and be in isolation. And it also, such isolation tricks games on your mind. I remember the first week we were isolated with COVID. Getting out of the house was a no-no, and you start becoming, you start losing your mind almost, like. And so having, being Putin and being in such a powerful position in global affairs, that also has this added dimension of playing psychological tricks on your mind. The other thing is that I think he is probably in a certain sense in some form of an information bubble, where, nobody wants to tell the emperor that he has no clothes, and it has to be some innocent child with 20/20 vision who may be the person to tell him that. It's on the other hand, let's not also forget that this may not be true. And, there is lots of psyops happening the world over. And is it possible that Putin is not as isolated as the American intelligence claims? It is entirely plausible, though I think they may have this one right. I don't think the connection between the silence in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and in this case are connected. I think in the case of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, his silence was strategic. There were reasons for his silence, whereas here his isolation is a completely different nature.
Okay, and then what was the Russian press perspective on the role of the diaspora, the Armenian diaspora, in the First Karabakh War? Was there any reflections on that?
I don't think I came across an article. I mean, there is lots of sort of, not waxing poetic, there's lots of mentions of the Armenian diaspora and the Armenian lobby in France and in the United States, but a lot of this coverage about the Armenian diaspora that you hear is usually Russian press talking about Azerbaijan's annoyance or Turkish annoyance with the factor of the Armenian diaspora and the Armenian lobbying efforts in the Western countries, and how these efforts have frustrated Azerbaijan's or Turkey's plans and their geopolitical objectives. So there wasn't a whole lot that the Russians talk about it, but they talk about it in the context of Azerbaijan's and Turkey's annoyance.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tonoyan. So for everyone, I've put in the chat the link to the book if you're interested in purchasing it. It includes a code that's for 50% off of the list price. You can do that. We want to thank Dr. Tonoyan for his overview of the book and also his comments on Ukraine. And we look forward to reading the book and want to thank you again. And good evening from the Armenian Studies program. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Serge. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.